It's a great day to glorify God. This is Pastor Jason Poling coming to you from the Shelter from the Storm podcast, a daily brief dive into God's Word, which is our shelter from the storms of life. We need to go and see who Jesus is and how we can go to him and experience comfort and help in our time of need. And so we are in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. Today we are starting in verse 32. A number of days ago, I finished the last podcast and took a little time off here to get some stuff done. But the context we were in before was the story of the rich young ruler. And then, of course, after that, the disciples were saying, well, hey, Jesus, we are unlike the rich young ruler. We gave up everything to follow you. And so will we be blessed in any way because of that? And Jesus, of course, says, absolutely. You will be blessed both here in this life, even though there will be persecutions, and you will be blessed beyond your wildest imaginations in the next life because of serving me. And then verse 31, he gives that very famous statement, but many who are first will be last, and the last first. So there's a great reversal that will happen at the end. Those that appear to have everything together, be the rich young ruler, seem to have achieved and succeeded in life and have a lot of social standing and maybe wealth, maybe health, maybe all the different things that we consider to be successful. They are self-made men and women. They will, at the great reversal when Jesus comes back, find themselves topsy-turvy, upside down. They will be the ones that will be left out in the dark, that will not have the riches they thought they deserved because they didn't look to Jesus. But those who have given up everything for Jesus and become weak in the eyes of the world and suffered for Jesus, those will, in the great reversal, receive everything. And so on the road, in verse 32 in our text, they were going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. So this image of Jesus really with no fear. I mean, he's just the hero, the absolute hero of the story. And he's got no fear marching right into Mordor, right into the lion's den to face the ultimate challenge and the ultimate enemy at the cross, death itself, and of course, Satan and sin. And they were amazed, right? They are just shocked by this because he'd already told them that he's going to Jerusalem and he's going to die. And so they just can't get their minds around why he would do this. And so those who followed were fearful in verse 32. And again, he knows this, and he's trying to help them slowly mature as disciples. He took them aside and began to tell them again what was happening to them. Verse 33, couldn't be clearer. Behold, we're going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests, the scribes. These are the leaders of the land, and they are going to take control of me, who is the leader of the universe. So it's a seemingly odd situation, but of course we know the whole point of why Jesus humbled himself to the point of death. And they will condemn him to death, and they will deliver him then to the Gentiles. So not only are the leaders of the Jews going to overtake him, he's going to be humiliated to the nth degree because the Gentiles, who the Jews despise, are now going to have their way with Jesus as well. And they will mock him and spit upon him and scourge him and kill him. But 3 days later, he will rise again. Of course, they don't quite still get that. And then verse 35, it's interesting because this is a parallel to when Peter in chapter 8, which is the pivotal text in the book of Mark, where everything turns on that text, when Peter says, you are the Christ. And then, of course, Jesus talks about him going to Jerusalem and dying. Peter reverses course and says, you shall not die. That's not going to happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, right? He missed the point. And again, here now, James and John, the other two of the inner circle of the three that followed Jesus in the closest way, verse 35, the sons of Zebedee came up and said, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Verse 36, Jesus, of course, knows what's going on, but he's always so gentle. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? Verse 37, grant that we may sit in your glory, one on your right hand and one on your left. They wanted to be honored above all the disciples, above all peoples. They wanted Jesus to they still didn't quite understand what was going on. Maybe they thought they were going to Jerusalem. Jesus was going to take over, be the big man in charge over Israel and kick Rome out. And they were going to be the two right hand and left hand men of the king. Jesus says to them, you do not know what you're asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? And of course, referring to the cup of the crucifixion, the cup of suffering, the cup of the judgment of God. Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm about to be baptized? Again, this baptism into fire, right? This baptism into suffering. And they said to him, we are able, which of course is so ridiculous because they don't get it. And they're just pompous and arrogant and foolish. And so are we often, right? We think we can do more on our own strength than we realize. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. So he said, you're going to suffer. And indeed, James and John both did. James, I believe this James is the one who was the first to be martyred of the 12 disciples. And then John, of course, lived the longest, but he went through an inordinate amount of suffering, being tortured and then being exiled and imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. So you've got these two guys that did indeed experience the cup of suffering. But verse 40, Jesus says, but to sit on my right hand or on my left, that is not mine to give. It is only for those to whom it has been prepared. So there's already a plan at stake here. This is not about Jesus getting an earthly kingdom. This is a bigger kingdom. And I always cite back to 1 Corinthians 15, a pivotal text about Jesus' whole agenda is to defeat all the enemies at the cross and resurrection and at the end times, and put everything under the feet of God the Father, so all things might be under him. And so it's God the Father is ultimately the one who is going to decide who's going to be on his right hand and left. And of course, Jesus will be there, not James and John or any of us. Now, hearing this, the other disciples begin to feel really upset, really indignant with James and John, right? There's a lot of jealousy and rivalry and competition going on, which of course happens all the time, even in religious circles, even with people that love Jesus. And it happens with pastors, it happens with Christian leaders and missionaries. There's always this petty rivalry because we lose sight of what we're really called to be about, which is to suffer, which is to not be great, which is to humble ourselves like Jesus, to go into Mordor and maybe die in the process, and with no fame or fanfare. Actually, people maybe not even thinking we're that worthy or that likable or whatever. And I think so many of us really, as leaders and pastors and Christians across the board in any ministry we find ourselves in, we want to be noticed. We want to be liked. Of course, I've got over 1,000 plays on my podcast, and I've celebrated that the last few podcasts. And that was exciting for a little guy like me, a small fish in a big pond of all these podcasters. But really, at the end of the day, that doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter at all. And it doesn't, it's equally not important as, or equally, it's as the guy who's got a million plays. Either one doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We're just called to do a job to proclaim the gospel and suffer and then enter into the glory of God together with no competition. And Jesus, of course, criticizes this competitive spirit. And he says in verse 42, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It's all about authority and power and who's up the food chain, who's down the food chain. But it is not so among you. That's not how he wants us to be, disciples. But whoever wishes to become great, if you really want to be great, you got to be the servant. Whoever wishes to be first, you got to be the slave of everyone. And do what Jesus did in the upper room, where he put on the towel and he took the basin of water and he washed the dirty feet of the disciples, something only servants and slaves would do. And Jesus did that. And so Jesus says in verse 45, his whole mission was to be this way and to show us how to be this way. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's just a challenge to all of us. It's not about how capable we are, how popular we are, how effective people think we are, how much we've achieved. Of course, not in business or in money making or any other profession, but definitely not in ministry. The Church of Jesus Christ is supposed to shine the way and show the way of Christ, which is the way of service and humility and suffering and death, to a world that doesn't get that. And here the disciples are great examples of what not to do and what not to get, right? They didn't get it at all. And we do that as well. And so we just have to be reminded and challenged and rebuked lovingly by Jesus to be servants, to not worry about our own image, about our own popularity or how people view us, but simply look at others and say, how can I view them, which really should be with eyes of love and compassion and willingness to serve them. That's really the essence of who Jesus was, and the essence of the gospel. Coming to that cross was an act of absolute service to people who didn't deserve it, but he did it anyway because he loved us. Hey, love you guys. We'll talk to you on the next podcast. God bless you.